Thank you. As a last talk, it's likely a little redundant for me to mention the number of animals this procedure impacts, the ongoing scientific discussion about its humaneness. We've heard them throughout this meeting. That's why we're here. Instead, I'd like to take this time to introduce why this research topic is important to me. I worked as a lab animal technician in the academic setting for 20 years before returning for a PhD. Over that time, there was a growing discussion that mounted over the humaneness of CO2 euthanasia. And at that time, as an end user, my attitude about this procedure ebbed and flowed with the scientific discussion and my anecdotal observations. So, my motivations for this survey was to try to understand what current perceptions and attitudes are regarding CO2 euthanasia in rodents. My colleagues had slightly different motivations. They hoped that this survey could identify areas that were important to those in lab animal science and help to inform future research priorities. For this survey, the specific research questions were to describe European and Canadian laboratory animal professionals and researchers' attitudes towards carbon dioxide euthanasia of rodents, and perceptions of barriers to the implementation of refinements. We distributed the survey to member associations of the Federation of European Laboratory Animal Science Associations and members of the Canadian Association for Laboratory Animal Science and the Canadian Association for Laboratory Animal Medicine. We received 657 total responses and 592 completed surveys. Europe represented 383 and Canada represented 209. First, we asked which primary method is typically used in your facility or laboratory to euthanize experimental animals. We did this to be able to understand the scope of carbon dioxide euthanasia within our participant group. Next, we asked a series of 3 questions to be able to assess attitude. The participants were asked to rank or score their answers on a 7-point Likert scale. And what you can see here is the questions. And I'm sure that many of you have filled out surveys similar to this with the 7-point Likert. We moved on to ask them, are there other methods of euthanizing rodents that you would consider an improvement over carbon dioxide? And for those that answered yes to this question, we asked them to describe any barriers that they perceive to implementing this improved method. Further, our participants were asked demographic questions such as age, gender, education, role within the lab animal community, and sector of employment. Our first results indicated that indeed carbon dioxide was the primary method of euthanasia for both Europe and Canadian participants. You can see 42% of European participants and 55% of Canadian participants said that their primary method of euthanasia was with carbon dioxide for rodents. And this is an exciting finding because as a community, we didn't have an answer to this question before from such a broad range of participants. Now we have this result, and it really reinforces the importance of understanding attitudes and perceived barriers to refinement for this very common procedure. These results are for participant attitude score towards CO2 euthanasia in rodents. What we used were the 3 questions that we used to assess attitude. Those questions were highly internally consistent, and we aggregated them together to create an attitude score, which is along the x-axis. It ranged from 1 to 7, 1 being very unfavorable views, and 7 being very favorable views of CO2 euthanasia in rodents. 4 would be the midpoint where they are neither favorable nor unfavorable views. This is not the distribution that we thought we would see. We thought we would see more participants that had unfavorable views, around 1, and then another peak of 7 that had very favorable views. But what we did find was that there was a average view of 4.36, which means that the participants had an average view of slightly favorable views towards CO2 euthanasia. There was no significant difference between European and Canadian attitude scores. We did find that female participants had slightly lower attitude scores than non-female participants, and there was no significant difference for other demographic factors such as age, education, role within the lab animal community, or sector of employment. When we asked them to explain their attitude scores, there were 4 themes that emerged from their text answers. The first being the animal experience, and this is framed in the context of the animal's perceived experience. A couple example quotes here would be, if done properly, it is a humane method of euthanasia. Another participant said, I feel that CO2 is extremely stressful and painful for the animal. A second theme was practical considerations, and that was framed from a human perspective as quick, efficient, readily available, or cost effective. So a couple of participant quotes here would be, it's fast, effective, and requires minimal training. A second participant said, this is good for large amounts of rodents. A third theme that we saw was a compromise, in which the participants expressed reservations about CO2 and described a compromise between both practical and the animal experience. For example, I believe that CO2 euthanasia is associated with poor welfare. However, until more practical solutions for rodent euthanasia are available, it may be our best available practical option. The last theme that we saw was a technical description. And with this, the participants did not offer their own opinion on CO2, but rather described processes or standards that they must follow. They also may have talked about that there was no clear alternative. We have here, carbon dioxide euthanasia is a Schedule 1 method in the UK and as such is permitted. And another participant stated, we still have no replacement method. And how was that represented in the data? Well, you can see here that around 60% of participant answers contain the theme of the animal experience. You'll also see that around 25% of participant answers contain the theme of practical considerations, and about 10% had the compromise, and about 10% contained a technical description. We then asked our participants if they believed there were refinements to the procedure of CO2 euthanasia. And we found that over 50% of our participants said yes. About 35% said maybe, and 10% said no, there were not refinements. Again, this surprised me in the context of the attitudes being slightly favorable towards the use of CO2. And if we look at this, we have over half of the participants that said that there is something right now that is a refinement to the procedure of carbon dioxide euthanasia. There's 35% said that there might be something better. And in this context, we asked those participants that said yes, there were refinements, to describe what they thought the barriers were to the implementation of those refinements. What we found was that 5 themes emerged to characterize these perceived barriers. The first were financial constraints. This included a lack of money, equipment, infrastructure, training, or time. One participant said, the monetary constraints, infrastructure may not be suitable. We need had to have professionally trained an operator to apply these methods correctly. The next theme was an institutional culture. This being there being an established culture in a certain way, change resistance, or an aesthetic displeasure for alternatives. Now, I recognize that some may think that it's odd to have aesthetic displeasure in this category, but we've thought a lot about this, and aesthetics is an aspect of cultural norms, and I'd be happy to discuss this further later. One of the things that one of the participants said was that in established culture, we've always done it this way. Another participant, number 58, said there's a resistance to change. And participant 42 said people are the main barrier. A third theme that came up was research constraints. And this is where carbon dioxide is required for scientific purposes within the research protocol. One participant said the barrier was the fear of interference with research results. Safety concerns came up as participants raised human or animal safety concerns. So, for example, waste isoflurane gas is hazardous to humans and is therefore a barrier. The last theme that came up as barriers were regulatory constraints. And these were either legal or regulatory frameworks and institutional policies. So we can see here, participant 156 said control substance legislation was a barrier, and participant 54 said personal license restrictions were barriers to these refinements. And what did we find? We found that 67% of participant responses contained the theme of financial constraints. This was consistent across Europe and Canada. We found that 17% contained the theme of institutional culture, and the rest of research constraints, safety concerns, and regulatory constraints contained about 10% of participant responses. So, overall, this does tell us that attitudes occupy a wide diversity from being extremely unfavorable to being extremely favorable, with an overall slightly favorable view towards the use of carbon dioxide for the euthanasia of rodents. The perceived animal experience is important in determining this attitude, and the majority of participants indicate that there are refined methods over carbon dioxide euthanasia, and that financial constraints is the main barrier to implementation of these refinements. If there's one thing to take away from this research today, is that we're here at this meeting focused on the scientific evidence and discussing experiments and reviews surrounding the humaneness of CO2 euthanasia methods. From what our participants said is that the next experiment isn't the most important thing to them. The most pressing barriers to implementing refinements to these practices are this. These are the barriers. The largest of which is not having enough financial resources, which incidentally shouldn't be used as justification for not being able to implement refinements. But it is real, and it's a practical constraint. These are surmountable barriers, and efforts should focus on institutional barriers to the adoption of refinements. Thank you.